Hi students, today we're going to take a look at a case called Regina versus Dudley and Stevens. This is an old case back from 1884. Regina, I believe, is the Queen of England. Dudley and Stevens are sailors. And when we look at this case, it's going to help us maybe better understand the debate between the legal positivists and the natural law theorists. Maybe it'll help us sort out how we should think about who's right there. Maybe not. We'll see. For the background of the case, there's this nice video that I've posted on Moodle. I'm not going to play it here. This is just sort of a picture from that video, but I would encourage you to check that out if you haven't already. So maybe you want to pause this and watch that intro. But I'm going to just sort of describe the details of that case, and we'll go from there. So here are some of the facts. I think anytime we look at a case, we want to start with, what do we know is true? What does everyone accept as true? The empirical sort of details. So the first thing is that there are sort of 4 men involved. 3 are going to play maybe a more central role. But there are 4 men out at sea: Dudley, the captain; Stevens, the first mate; Brooks, a sailor; and Parker, a cabin boy. They had been on a ship. It had been destroyed. They're in now sort of like a lifeboat floating around. They run out of food, so their ship capsizes so quick they weren't really able to take much food with them. So they had, I guess, like a can of turnips that they ate. They captured a turtle at one point and ate that. But they were at sea for 20 or so days at this point, and they are hungry. And the belief was that drinking salt water was really bad for you. It's going to make you sick, maybe even kill you. So they wanted to try and avoid that. And so they're hungry. Now, Dudley proposes that they cast lots to decide who among them should be sacrificed in order to save the others. But Brooks, the sailor, objects to this plan. So they've been days without food or water. They're thinking, how are we going to survive? Brooks is sort of like, I don't think we should just kill someone. I'm not down for that. But this conversation sort of continues, and a couple of days later, Dudley and Stevens decide that they really do need to do something. And Parker's ill at this point. As Sandel puts it in his video, he's sort of like, curled up in part of the boat. I think Wikipedia suggests that maybe he's like in a coma, or he's really in bad shape. Now, they think he's doing the least well of all of us. We should just sacrifice him to save the others. And so sort of Dudley sort of says this prayer. He sort of sees it as a solemn kind of act, but he does go ahead and kill Parker. So Dudley kills Parker, and they eat him, right? They eat his flesh, they drink his blood. It helps them survive. Maybe you're thinking like, John, are you just making this up? No, this is the story. This happened. 4 days later, these the remaining sailors, right, or Dudley, Stevens, Brooks, they're rescued. Now they're brought back to land, and Dudley and Stevens are charged with murder. So Dudley, it sounds like, actually commits the murder. Stevens kind of holds Parker down in case he tries to get away or something like that. So these two are charged with murder, and they admit to having killed Parker. In their defense, they say that their act was justified by necessity, since had they not killed Parker, they very likely would have died. So they admit they killed a person, but they say, well, it was justified because we wanted to save our lives. Now, this leads us to a sort of a legal question, right? And in a lot of these cases that we look at, we're going to sort of try and separate out the legal question from the philosophical question. There's often like this philosophical issue in the background that we need to solve in order to answer the legal question. So the legal question here is this: are Dudley and Stevens guilty of murder? Right? And so we just need to decide, guilty or not guilty. In order to answer that question, however, right, there might be some philosophical question we have to answer, and that's sort of the why we're doing philosophy of law. If I was just doing a law class, I could tell you what the answer was, right? But the thought is, well, maybe this question's a little bit trickier, and there's this philosophical issue that's interesting that we need to sort out. Okay. Before we do that, one thing I want to encourage you to do on a regular basis, right, is to think about when you know sort of the facts of a new case or something, think about like what do you think the court would say in this case? Do you think it ruled in favor of Dudley and Stevens, right? Decided that they were innocent? Or do you think it ruled against them, found them guilty? And then why do you think the one thing rather than the other? And what reasons can you give sort of for thinking that they're guilty of murder? What reasons can you give to think that they're not guilty? And why do you arrive at that conclusion? Maybe this question sort of forces you to think about your own view, like, do you think we should find them guilty? Do you think we should find them innocent? So on. So you might want to take a second, pause the video to think about that. And once you're done, just go ahead and start it again and find out what actually happened. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the majority opinion here, and all the cases we read, for the most part, are going to have a majority opinion and a dissenting opinion. The majority opinion, sort of like most of the judges agreed with this. I think in this case, actually, there's no dissenting opinion. I think all the judges agreed. But in some of the cases, we'll get dissenting opinions where one of the judges or justices says, I know you all think this thing, but I disagree with you, and here's why. And those dissenting opinions are actually pretty important, even though they're not the law, right? Going forward, they can sometimes influence how future courts will rule, and maybe a court rules one way this year, and 50 years from now, we'll sort of see that dissenting opinion and say, you know what, there was something there, and sort of take up that line of reasoning. So dissenting opinions can be important. But anyway, we don't have to worry about that. Here, in this case, the justices ruled that Dudley and Stevens were guilty of murder, and they sentenced the two to death. Now, what's interesting about this case, right, is that we have some laws about murder, intentionally killing people with malice aforethought, right? That's murder, and that's going to get you in trouble, maybe sentenced to death here. But clearly this case isn't the standard case of murder, right? Dudley and Stevens didn't just not like Parker and kill him. They were in like a really tense, high-stress situation. And so there might be some seemingly like mitigating factors. The law presumably never considered this case, this kind of situation, when they wrote down sort of the rules. And so we might wonder, like, how did the judges decide on this sentence? Now, one thing I want to note, sort of just kind of in passing, but I think is important, is that the crown, the queen, the executive branch is going to later commute their sentences to 6 months imprisonment. So if you were feeling bad for Dudley and Stevens, like, oh my gosh, these two are sentenced to death for trying to save their lives, you don't need to feel too bad for them. But I think this sort of gets at this tension in this case. So on the one hand, maybe it does look like they're guilty according to the law. On the other hand, the queen, the executive, decides, maybe they're guilty, but that wasn't really all that bad, and so maybe they don't deserve to die for it. So anyway, let's take a look at the reasoning. So the majority's opinion, written by Chief Justice Lord Coleridge, argues that the temptation to the act which existed here, right, the temptation to murder, the temptation to kill Parker, was not what the law has ever called necessity. So there is this sort of necessity defense. I had to do this thing. But here's like maybe a more standard necessity case. So a standard necessity case is one where maybe somebody is stuck on a railroad track and you see a train coming for that person. And what you do is you run out onto the train track, ignoring the no trespassing sign that we see here. And you trespass, you help the person off the track, and then you run out of there. Now, maybe, in this case, it looks like Florida East Coast Railway Company or something like that. Maybe they could come after you and say, hey, you trespassed on our land, we want to fine you $200. But you could say, I did it of necessity. I had to save this person's life, and that's what justified me. That's a standard necessity case where you do something illegal for the greater good. Now that's kind of what Dudley and Stevens were arguing. We did something that was illegal, but it was for the greater good. But the justices are not buying that excuse here. And the justices say this, and I think this is the interesting bit. So they say, though law and morality are not the same thing, and many things may be immoral, which are not necessarily illegal, yet the absolute divorce of law from morality would be a fatal consequence. So they think we need to connect law and morality in a certain way. And this maybe harkens back right to the natural law theory. Like there's some important connection between the law and morality, that the law depends on morality in a certain kind of way. Okay, the court continues. They say, this divorce between the law and morality would follow if the temptation to murder in this case were to be held by law an absolute defense of it. It's not so. To preserve one's life is generally speaking a duty, but it may be the plainest and highest duty to sacrifice it. So what they're getting at here is that Dudley and Stevens are the captain and the first mate, and that they've been shipwrecked. And they say there are times, right, when people need to sacrifice their life for others, not always be looking out for their own life over those of others. The particular examples they give are examples like war or something like that, where you might be called to sacrifice your life, go into a harmful, dangerous situation and die for your country. And here they thought it was kind of the captain and the first mate's responsibility that they be the ones that sacrifice themselves, rather than picking Parker, right, the sickest one, the youngest one, to kill for the rest of their sakes. Now, I think that this is tricky. I'm hesitant to say that captains and first mates have a moral responsibility to sacrifice themselves for the other people. Maybe ideally, like early on, if they had known that this was going to happen, they could have done that. Maybe by the time that where they're hungry, they're starving, Parker does really look like he's about to die, maybe it's best that they don't kill one of themselves, and rather than Parker. I'm not sure. What's important though is that they're saying, like, when we are thinking about this case, we need to think about the morality of it, and the morality is going to help us figure out what the right result is. And here they think, the right result is saying that, yeah, you're guilty, you shouldn't have murdered this guy. Now, again, maybe that speaks a little bit in favor of natural law theory. Maybe they're appealing right to morality in justifying the ruling. But, there are other potential explanations here. As we sort of look forward, right, I want you to think about, how you think the court should have ruled. Should they have ruled in favor of Dudley and Stevens? Should they rule against them? And why? Right? One thing we're doing, we're learning about arguments and how to construct them. Maybe you want to try and construct your own argument for the conclusion that the court should have ruled in favor of Dudley and Stevens, or the court should have ruled against them. Put it in that valid form that we've discussed. That would be a nice sort of practice activity. Alright, that's all for now. Next time we're going to uh, return to some of these issues, this debate between natural law theorists and legal positivists. We're going to be looking at a case called Riggs versus Palmer.